50 KTRS. William C. Davis is with us, professor of history at Virginia Tech. He's also a Civil War historian. He's written a new book called The Crucible of Command, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The war they forged and the peace, the war they fought and the peace they forged. Professor Davis, welcome to KTRS here in St. Louis.
Good morning. Good morning. Nice to talk to somebody from my home state.
Oh, you're from St. Louis?
Independence, the other side of the state.
All right. Well, we claim independence. That's all right. How long have you been a professor at Virginia Tech?
Actually, I just retired. I was there 14 years.
Okay.
And, before that, spent a long time in the publishing industry and then just freelance writing.
Sure. I almost went to Virginia Tech, so you almost had me, you almost yelled at me for falling asleep in your class so many years ago.
You wouldn't have been alone.
Virginia Tech, by the way, it should also be noted that you are the only school that beat Ohio State, the national champions, this year.
I know, and I hope they're going to go to their graves remembering that they got beat by one of the worst teams in the NCAA.
All right, there we go. Professor Davis, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant, of course, marrying here in St. Louis and marrying a St. Louis girl and having so many connections here in St. Louis. Their relationship has always been one that has been sort of an interesting one, right?
Yeah, well, in a way, you could say they didn't have a relationship. They only met 4 times that we know of. They were not friends necessarily. Well, certainly they were not friends. Yet they have one of those relationships that's kind of forged in memory after the men were dead because of what the two of them did. And it helps that they get presented as opposites. Therefore, each can kind of they bounce off the other as writers sort of increase the myths of both.
So what was your idea? What was the point of this story? What did you want to tell?
My real interest was not so much in the battles and campaigns, which have been done to death, but rather in trying to explore the inner men to see what similarities and differences there were between them in their worldviews, their ethics, their moral codes, their senses of humor, how their family lives, that sort of thing, and to try to determine, if possible, if the development of all those aspects of their personalities then influenced the way they made decisions when they were given great choices to make as generals.
Yeah. They were both... Is it true that Robert E. Lee was offered the North Command?
Yes, he was. He was offered command of the army that was going to be built around Washington, D.C. He wasn't offered command of the entire Union Army, but of what would have been the biggest army in American history. That was to be built around Washington to protect it and then to move into Virginia and put down the rebellion. And
he turned it down?
Yeah, he turned it down. And contrary to popular misconception, there was never any question in Lee's mind that he would turn it down. He hoped right up to the end that he wouldn't have to be put in a position of choosing sides. But he always knew that if Virginia chose to secede, then his loyalty would follow his state, and he would have to resign his commission.
Very different than the philosophy today. We all, we were joking about Virginia Tech and Ohio and Missouri, and a lot of people have, their allegiance to Missouri, but not to make light of it, but the winning running back last night plays for Ohio State, and he's from Missouri, so we don't have those same sensibilities today as they had then.
No, that sense of local, it's still around pretty strong, especially in some places like Texas. But by and large, that sense of localism and local loyalties first disappeared. It's one of the things the Civil War helped to kill. It's worth bearing in mind that at the time the Civil War began in 1861, well, by the time the Constitution was framed and Virginia became a state, Virginia had already been an independent entity for 180 years. So these old families really grew up with a strong local loyalty, especially because of the competition there was among the 13 colonies prior to the formation of the Union.
Robert E. Lee and Grant were two different sides. They, many differences, but they were both full of pride and both loved their country, and ultimately, in the end, put aside their own sensibilities and their own prejudices for the betterment of the Union. Did they not?
Yeah, they did, with qualifications. In the for both of them. It was easier for Grant, of course, because there was never any question in his mind that the Union was paramount, the Constitution was paramount. Grant repeatedly said, "I will obey any law, even one I don't like, because it's the law of the land." And if a time came that he couldn't in conscience obey a law, then he would resign his command. For Lee, after the war, it was a case of making himself an example to other Southerners to accept the result of the war and to go back to work, stay in the South, try to rebuild themselves, rebuild the South, and at the same time try to rebuild themselves politically so they could still kind of attempt to hold on to as much of their way of life as they had. Lee accepted the result of Appomattox, but he never really acquiesced. After 1865, he never refers to himself as an American, only as a Virginian or a Southerner. So he has a little resentment, probably more than a little, in fact.
How much? That's interesting. We know what happens to Grant. He goes on to become president.
Right.
What happens to Robert E. Lee?
He could have been a wealthy man. He never had been. But immediately after the war and for the next 2 or 3 years, everybody was after him. Railroad companies, insurance companies, was after him to become a figurehead president. This idea of celebrity product endorsement is not new with Michael Jordan. It was going on then, too. All the insurance companies were scrambling to get Civil War generals to be their figurehead presidents, with paying very nice salaries. But Lee refused to do that. He had a sense that he had to set an example. And, of course, what he does is he accepts the presidency of what was then called Washington College, which was in a bad way. And during the 4 years that he lived as its president, he really went a long way toward remaking the college and building it, making it successful, expanding curriculum, providing a place for Southern students to go to college, and putting it on the road to be the great university it is today as Washington and Lee. So he lived the example he was calling on others to follow.
And he only lived 4 more years after Appomattox?
Yeah, he died in October 1870. Lee was not a well man during much of the war. He suffered angina. He probably had at least one heart attack. There are indications that he may have had something akin to a stroke at one time. On top of which, he was a man who really felt his life had pretty much been a failure. So he was not in really great emotional or sort of mental, psychic, mental shape, I guess. And the result of the war just aged him tremendously. He was 63 when he died, but he looked 10 years older.
The book is called Crucible of Command. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, The War They Fought and the Peace They Forged. Professor William C. Davis is the author and our guest for a couple more minutes. How did you go about researching this?
Well, in the case of Grant, it's not easy, of course, but in the case of Grant, fortunately, the Ulysses S. Grant Association has just completed editing and publication of his papers. So there's 33 volumes of Grant's papers. It's not exactly one-stop shopping, but it's close to it. Lee was a tremendous letter writer, and there are thousands of his letters around, and that required a lot of looking because they're scattered all over the country. So it was, even a lot of them were published in newspapers that nobody even knows about, so it involved looking through newspapers as well. It was a considerable research challenge, but it was always interesting. The research is the fun. It's like playing Christopher Columbus.
Sure. What was the one thing you found while researching it that you opened that you found that you said, aha?
The one thing, there's several of those aha moments. One of them, I think, was the realization of Lee's religious outlook. He began, when he got out of West Point, as a man with no interest in it whatever. Indeed, his wife would nag him about the fact that he wasn't being very, very spiritual. After the war with Mexico, he suddenly went through some kind of a conversion that eventually turned him into what we would call a providentialist. He figured God rules everything, man has nothing whatever to do in what goes on earth. It is our duty simply to put up with the misery God will send us until we die, and then we'll be happy in paradise. It's a real downer of a viewpoint. But what you can see is that if God is responsible for everything, that kind of frees a general's hand to take enormous risks, because it's really not his decision, but the Almighty's, whether or not they succeed. And Lee, no general of the war, took greater risks than Lee.
Wow. Now, Robert E. Lee spent some time here in St. Louis, did he not?
Yeah, he was working on the levees there, trying, as many have tried, to control the river. And he wasn't there long enough to finish the project he was on. He really didn't like St. Louis, sorry to say that. He thought Missourians were kind of rough and dirty and unkempt, and they weren't like Virginians. He actually says that at one point. They weren't his sort of people. Grant, on the other hand, loved St. Louis.
For the same reasons.
And when he was in the White House, in fact, he had dreams at times of coming back to live in St. Louis after he left the presidency, but that, of course, didn't work out.
Right.
You've got a very fine Grant Historic Site out there, and it has a barn that Grant had built, anticipating that he would come back and raise horses.
Right. The thing that always amazes me about Grant and about Lee is the Appomattox Courthouse. They go, they meet, they talk, and Lee gives him his gun, and Grant says, no, keep the gun, go talk to the troops. I find that, or keep your sword. I find that extraordinary. Well, it virtually certain it didn't happen. Really?
There's no one who was there of the witnesses to the surrender ceremony said anything about Lee offering his sword, and I believe in his memoirs Grant said that it didn't happen. But myth got started very quickly. Within a matter of just weeks, there are these stories of Lee offering his sword, Grant refusing it. There are also stories that the surrender ceremony didn't take place in the McLean house at Appomattox, but it took place under an apple tree someplace, and that apple tree soon disappeared as people cut it up into slivers of souvenirs as holy relics. So there's a lot of myth about both of these men, and even about Appomattox. The important thing, I think, though, that gets to the same point you're talking about, is that when Grant gets back to his lines and he announces that Lee's army has surrendered, some units start to fire a celebratory salute, and he immediately issues an order saying, "Stop all that noise. We're all the same people now." So there'll be no glorying, there'll be no gloating, no rubbing salt in the wounds of the recently surrendered Confederates. So he was very, very attuned both to Lee's sensitivities and those of Confederate soldiers, knowing that the less humiliation they feel, the less rocky the road to reunification is likely to be.
But doesn't Lee also say to his troops, hey, we can start a jungle war for the next 50 years, put your arms down and accept the fact?
There were those who were urging Lee, urging Jefferson Davis and Lee both, to revert to a guerrilla style of war, take to the hills, and that it would take years to hunt them down. There isn't time to go into it, but the idea is totally impractical for them at that time. But Lee also discourages that. By this time, Lee wants the war to be over, and he too knows that the country's going to have to go through a reconciliation process, and that prolonging the war, costing the North more blood and more treasure, in the end was not likely to change anything, except to make it even harder for the two sides to come back together.
I would have gotten a C-, hopefully, in your class.
Well, no, you'd have gotten an F because you'd have been asleep.
Well, I feel like I'm growing because I stayed away through this interview. Professor Davis, professor of history at Virginia Tech. He's a Civil War historian. His new book is called Crucible of Command, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, the war they fought and the peace they forged. Professor, thank you very much for your time. Good luck with the book.
It's been delightful. Thank you.
William C. Davis, the Crucible of Command, here on the Big 550 KTRS. St. Patrick's